Hello, everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the Litchfield GAR Civil War Roundtable. My name is Bailey Schluter. I'm the director of the Meeker County Museum, as well as the organizer for this roundtable. Just a couple of announcements before we get started. The museum has an upcoming event on February 23rd at 7 p.m. Meeker County Assistant Chief Judge Stephanie Beckman will be giving a presentation entitled The Constitutionality of District Courts. She'll be talking about her career within the judicial system, the role of judges at the local level, and how the role of district court judges has been defined in the Constitution over time. I'm really excited for this one. This is a free event that will be hosted at the Litchfield Opera House on Tuesday, February 23rd at 7 p.m. This is an in-person event, but if you feel more comfortable attending virtually, I can make that happen. Please just submit an RSVP to the museum so that we can plan accordingly. You can RSVP through our website at meekercomuseum.org/district courts. And I'll put that link in the chat a little bit later so you can copy it and save it. Our second announcement is regarding our Abraham Lincoln event. You might remember that this was tentatively scheduled, I think, for January, but we had to postpone it due to new COVID regulations. But we are back on. Bryce Stenzel is a famed Abraham Lincoln impersonator, and he's going to be in Litchfield on March 20th at 3 p.m. That's a Saturday, March 20th at 3 p.m. to present with charity for all Abraham Lincoln and the U.S. Dakota War trials. In this presentation, Stenzel will act as the president as he deliberates and later explains his decision whether or not to approve the execution of 308 Dakota natives who were found guilty for their actions taken during the U.S. Dakota War. It's a fantastic presentation. Stenzel has acted as Abraham Lincoln in front of multiple legislatures and conferences across the country, so I'm excited to have him in Litchfield. Tickets will go on sale on February 20th, and I will send an email out to the roundtable membership when those tickets are available. Again, they'll be hosted at the Litchfield Opera House. That's a space that's better allows for social distancing, so that more people can come to the event if they so choose. There will be a virtual option available as well, because we don't want anyone to feel like they're missing out on this. And now regarding the Civil War Symposium, I've gotten a few questions about that. I met with members of the committee yesterday, and we discussed hosting a virtual half-day Civil War Symposium with 3 speakers who were originally scheduled to present in 2020. We're working out those speakers now, we're working out the schedule, but right now we're thinking it'll be the same day, Saturday, April 3rd, 2021, entirely from the comfort of your own home online. So I'll have more information. As I get more information, I'll send that out to you. A lot of emails coming in the next few weeks, but you know, we're working hard to get a symposium together since we had to cancel last year. So hopefully you can come to that or watch the presentations online a little bit later. All right. Well, without further ado, I'm happy to introduce Douglas Waller. Douglas Waller is the author of the best-selling books Wild Bill Donovan, Red Red, and The Commandos, as well as the critically acclaimed works such as Disciples, the story of 4 CIA directors who fought for Donovan's OSS in World War II, and a biography about General Bill Mitchell, A Question of Loyalty. Waller is coming to us from his home in Raleigh, North Carolina, and he is presenting on his latest book, Lincoln Spies. There it is. Lincoln Spies, The Secret War to Save the Union. This is his website, douglascwaller.com, where you can order a copy of his book. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to Mr. Waller.
Okay.
Yay!
Well, thanks, Bailey. Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, okay. I'm still getting adjusted. I've done several of these talks virtually, and so I'm still getting kind of adjusted to it. Um, Before I start, actually, a little truth in advertising to start off with here. I'm not a Civil War historian. I don't even play one on TV. I covered the CIA for a number of years for Newsweek and then Time magazine. And as Bailey mentioned, my last two historical biographies were of major intelligence figures during World War II. One of the books was on Wild Bill Donovan, who headed up Franklin Roosevelt's spy service. And as Bailey mentioned, the other book was on men who worked for Donovan in the Office of Strategic Services, like Alan Dulles, who later became CIA director. For my next book, I decided to switch wars and write an ensemble biography of 4 Union spies during the Civil War, 4 of Lincoln spies. And I'm really actually kind of glad I made the switch. You know, when we think of the Civil War, we have this image of Union and Confederate soldiers posing stiffly in Matthew Brady photographs, or the soft violin music of a Ken Burns documentary, which actually always put me to sleep when I heard it, and of the mangled bodies strewn over desolate battlefields where thousands died in mass attacks like Pickett's Charge. Now, all that happened, but what also happened in this conflict was a revolution in warfighting technology like the world has never seen. Things like rifled cannon and muskets that could deliver more accurate and deadly fire at longer ranges, and railroads that could move men and supplies quickly to the front, and the telegraph that could connect war departments, generals, and far-flung battlefields with rapid communications. This was a war that also saw a change in how armies maneuvered against each other. Instead of the old Napoleonic tactics of frontal assaults with soldiers packed tightly together, uh, military leaders on both sides started choosing flank attacks and loose order tactics so they could win these fights without encouraging such horrendous casualties. But commanders quickly discovered that with all these new weapons and all their new tactics, they needed far more accurate information on where the enemy lurked ahead of them and how strong that enemy was. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson boiled it down to 4 things he wanted to know before he started a battle. 4 important pieces of intelligence. Number 1, the position of the enemy. Where was he out there? Obviously, very important information. Number 2, the number of hostile troops you faced and their movements, also very important information. Number 3, the generals in command of the other side. Who led their corps, their division, their brigades, their regiments? You have to remember a good many of these Northern and Southern generals had been West Point classmates, so they had a good sense of how the leader on the other side would react in battle. And the 4th thing that Jackson wanted to know was the location of the headquarters for the other commander. Now, these were important pieces of information. They didn't necessarily guarantee a commander victory, but they increased the odds for success, and they certainly could stave off defeat. So what you discover is that beneath the surface of this vast war between the North and the South, a revolution was also occurring in military intelligence collection, in the way armies spied on each other. And that's what I actually found fascinating as I dug more deeply into the subject. Of course, there was a traditional cloak and dagger work we've seen in previous wars. Each side sent scores of spies into the other's territory to try and steal secrets. In the Civil War, this job was made easier because these secret operatives spoke the other side's language and they knew its culture. So they weren't dropping into a foreign country with a language and customs that were different from theirs, as what happened during the World War II, for example. Civil War spies had an easier time blending in and not being noticed by the enemy. If you were a Northern spy, it wasn't too hard to fake a Southern accent. The new war-making technology also ushered in new types of spying. With the advent of the telegraph, signal intelligence became important in this war. Today, it's called SIGINT in the spy jargon. Back then, it was reading the enemy's messages that were tapped out on Morse code over a telegraph line. Each side suspected the other was constantly tapping into what it transmitted, so messages were encrypted in a fairly primitive code. Photography was soon found to be a useful spy tool. Photographers joined the Union Army to covertly take shots of enemy troop encampments and future battlefields. We saw aerial reconnaissance used often in this war. Hydrogen gas-filled balloons, mostly on the Union side, were sent into the air as high as 1,000 feet, with aeronauts dangling in their wicker baskets to scope out the battlefield ahead or direct fire on an artillery on a target. These were the forerunners of the spy satellites that we have today. During the Civil War, this was considered pretty high-tech endeavor. Balloonists communicated their observations by shouting to the ground or using flag signals or tapping out messages over a telegraph line strung to the soldier below. In Philadelphia, an inventor even proposed what a century and a half later would be called an aerial drone. A battery-operated camera attached under a small balloon would be sent up with the camera hooked by wire to a soldier on the ground who could deliver an electrical charge in order to activate the camera shutter. A Union officer eventually rejected the inventor's idea. He couldn't see how the balloon could keep the camera stable enough to take a clear photo, which was exactly the case back then. For this book, I decided to focus on 3 men and 1 woman who spied for the Union. I did so for several reasons. I found that the Union operatives to be far more interesting than their Confederate counterparts. 2 of my spies were heroes in this war. One of them was a failure, and the other one was an absolute scoundrel. So I had a pretty good mix of characters here. Also, Civil War movies often have the rebels outperforming the Yankees in espionage, but that really wasn't the case. For most of the Civil War, the Yankees had a much more comprehensive and effective intelligence gathering operation than the Confederates ever fielded. So by the end of the conflict, Ulysses Grant actually had a better count of Robert E. Lee's forces than Lee even had. The 4 Lincoln spies that are subjects of this book are Allen Pinkerton, Lafayette Baker, George Sharp, and Elizabeth Van Lew, and you see them on that composite photo there. Okay, let's start with Pinkerton. He's up in there in the top left corner. Friends believe that Allen Pinkerton was gifted with unusual powers of observation. Born in Scotland in 1819, as a young man, he trained to be a cooper, that's a barrel maker. But he ended up spending more time working as a labor agitator, falling under the spell of Scottish revolutionaries. In 1842, Pinkerton emigrated to America with his young wife, ending up eventually in Chicago, where he founded a private detective agency and in the mid-1850s, and it had become wildly successful by then. Pinkerton hated slavery. He became a fanatical abolitionist. His parents thought he thought his parents were atheists, and he actually considered himself an atheist as well. As a detective, he honed a sixth sense to anticipate criminal activity before it happened. He was stubbornly persistent, refusing to be worn down by adversity, but he could be a tiresome prig who harangued employees, friends, and relatives about the virtues of honesty, integrity, and courage, and all that kind of good stuff. He was a tyrant, though, at home, completely dominating his wife. He named the 3 children she bore for him without even consulting her. You know, pretty tough guy. Pinkerton had dark, brooding eyes, and you can kind of see it there in the photo, that were set deeply under a wide brow with a heavy beard that covered his face, save for his upper lip that he occasionally shaved. He was usually dour and humorless. He was a master publicist, though, skilled at promoting his detective business and absolutely shameless about airbrushing his own image. In February 1861, on the eve of the Civil War, Pinkerton, who by then had become somewhat famous nationwide as a private eye, launched what amounted to a covert operation to sneak Abraham Lincoln unnoticed in a railroad car through Baltimore. The detective, who happened to be investigating threats to a rail line for a business client at the time, had uncovered evidence that secessionists wanted to assassinate the new president-elect at a stopover in Baltimore in order to keep him from being inaugurated in Washington. Our next spy is Lafayette Baker, and he's there in the upper right-hand corner. He was a handsome man. He had brown hair and a full red beard. You can't really see it, of course, in the black and white photo. And he had piercing gray eyes that were almost hypnotic. And maybe you can kind of see the eyes there. They really are kind of hypnotic. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall and a muscular 180 pounds. He was agile and almost cat-like in his quick movements, always seemingly restless. Baker was a fine horseman and a crack shot, and he didn't swear or drink alcohol. He was obsessed with Roman history. His idol became Eugene Francois Verdoc, who was this unsavory detective who helped create France's security service. Baker was as devious and manipulating as Verdoc. He was prone to lie about himself, and he had the heart of a sneak thief, according to one profile that was done on him. Born in 1825, Baker's lineage traced back to the fighters in the French and Indian War. Fed up with his father, who was an insufferably stern Puritan, Baker renounced God and ran away from his Michigan home in his late teens, largely uneducated, save for a little schooling that taught him how to read and write. For the next 10 years, he drifted from job to job through a dozen states, often having to flee a city after a gunfight with another man. He finally ended up in San Francisco by the mid-1850s, joining a vigilante committee that rounded up suspected criminals in that lawless city and lynched the ones they thought deserved the death penalty. When the Civil War started, Baker, who was back on the East Coast, rode into Washington, hoping to land a good-paying job with the Union Army. He was outraged that the rebels had captured Fort Sumter on April 13, 1861. Baker had no spy training beyond what he might have picked up as a San Francisco vigilante, but he was a fast talker. And he managed to talk General Winfield Scott, the Union Army's aging commander, into giving him a job as a Secret Service agent. Scott, whose nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers because he enjoyed military pomp, had no spies to speak of, and he figured he really didn't have much to lose by hiring Baker. Our next spy is George Sharp, and he's down there in the bottom left-hand corner. His superiors considered him a natural military leader. He had a magnetic personality that made people want to follow him. He had a balding head, and you can see it there, and sad eyes and that droopy mustache that gave him the look more of a city preacher than a combat commander. Sharp, though, was a learned man. In his breast pocket of his uniform, he kept always a small, well-thumbed book of verses of his favorite poets, which he routinely read to his men, and they never seemed to object to the poetry readings. Sharp was born in Kingston, New York, a small town on the Hudson River. The son of a wealthy merchant, he received the finest education you could have at that time. He attended elite academies as a youngster. He graduated from Rutgers University, where incidentally he delivered the valedictory address in Latin, which I thought was kind of neat. And he earned a law degree from Yale University. Before setting up his practice as an attorney in Kingston, Sharp spent 4 years in Europe studying French in Paris and working as a secretary in the US legation in Vienna and Rome, where he learned Italian. When war broke out, he first commanded a company of federal militiamen in the Kingston area, and later he led a volunteer infantry regiment as a colonel. It all prepared Sharp for the most important job he would have as the Union Army's premier spy master. Now to our fourth secret agent, Elizabeth Van Lew. Like Sharp, she too was a child of privilege, but in a very different setting. Elizabeth's father was a wealthy Richmond hardware merchant. Her mother was a highly educated socialite who stocked the library in their mansion in the fashionable fashionable Church Hill neighborhood with almost 600 books. Elizabeth, who developed an early empathy for slaves she witnessed being beaten on Richmond streets, was sent to relatives in Philadelphia to be educated. A governess there lectured her on the abolition of slavery. She returned to Richmond with an even fiercer hatred of human bondage. When her father died in 1843, Elizabeth Van Lew spent much of her sizable inheritance, which was about $350,000 in today's money, helping family slaves flee north, or secretly paying the salaries of the blacks who remained at her mansion. She also bought other slaves on the market block to set them free. She was a short woman who had been quite beautiful in her youth, but when the Civil War started, Van Loo was in her 40s and unmarried, and she was considered by Richmond standards, or Richmond society, to be an old maid. She loved her state. She always spoke of Virginians in her soft Southern accent as our people, although that love would be tested sorely in the years to come. She wore her hair, her dark blonde hair, and there it looks black, but it was actually a dark blonde hair, always in tight curls, and you can kind of see the tight curls there. She had a thin, nervous-looking face with high cheekbones, a pointed nose, and sparkling blue eyes that bore into anyone facing her stare. She was almost always attired in the antebellum style with a black silk dress, as she is in this picture, and a bonnet whose ribbon tied under her chin in the front. She was clever to the point of almost unearthly brilliance, friends said, and she was decidedly feisty. She could be acid-tongued and scalding in her contempt for people whose political views clashed with her own strong sense of right from wrong. Elizabeth acknowledged that it had made her life intensely sad and earnest, as she put it. Yet when she thought it would help her have her way, she could be gentle and flattering. She knew how to cultivate powerful men to get what she wanted. When Union prisoners began pouring into Richmond, many of them housed in filthy tobacco warehouses that became makeshift jails, Elizabeth cajoled Confederate authorities to let her bring meals and books to the POWs and to minister to the Union soldiers who were wounded or ill. It soon made her a pariah in her city. Neighbors shunned her. Richmond newspapers published dark warnings that she should be showing compassion for Southern soldiers, not those hated Yankees. A Ku Klux Klan-like group called the Whitecaps sent her a menacing note threatening to burn down her mansion. But this woman was a Unionist who could not be intimidated. Soon, Elizabeth Van Loo began heading up a large and powerful spy ring in the capital of the Confederacy. Okay, now, there's a fifth important character in this story about Lincoln spies, and that's Abraham Lincoln himself. Honest Abe was the image his political campaign created. Lincoln actually didn't even like the nickname Honest Abe. He preferred to be addressed as Mr. Lincoln. He was one of the least experienced men ever to assume the presidency, but he was hardly a neophyte when it came to the dark arts of intrigue and subterfuge. During his brief brush with a military service in the 1832 Black Hawk War, Lincoln spent several weeks in a unit called the Independent Spy Company, which carried out reconnaissance operations. He often wrote newspaper columns under aliases to attack opponents. He secretly bought a German language newspaper to print puff pieces on him for that very important voting bloc in Illinois. And during his race for the presidency, he was a careful reader and evaluator of political intelligence. Once in the White House, Lincoln ordered General Scott to deliver him daily intelligence reports on the enemy and had freelancers all over the country send him information on the rebels and their sympathizers. He prodded his military commanders to accept new warfighting technologies like the balloons for aerial reconnaissance. He had no qualms about launching risky covert operations against the South. He found subversion and propaganda useful tools to undermine the border states that had joined the Confederacy and to keep the ones that remained with the Union under his tight control. And Lincoln could be absolutely ruthless when he felt he had to be, suspending the writ of habeas corpus, allowing the arbitrary arrest of thousands, and shuttering newspapers considered hostile to administration war aims. Clearly, this was a president who knew how to keep a secret and how to operate in secret. So, okay, what did these four spies do in this war? We'll start with Alan Pinkerton. He became the spy master for George McClellan's army, for General McClellan. He was the charismatic young Napoleon, as he was called, the commander of the all-important Army of the Potomac, and at first the entire U.S. Army. McClellan was the man Lincoln and the North had high hopes for defeating the South quickly and bringing this awful rebellion to an end. But his young Napoleon had a huge ego and an even bigger Messiah complex. He turned out to be better at organizing and training and parading an army than he was at fighting with it. Alan Pinkerton brought about 20 employees to Washington from his Chicago detective agency. He recruited more agents from the Army and other sources. And soon he was operating on a $6,500 a month budget, which was a lot of money in those days. Pinkerton used to use the cover name E.J. Allen in all his correspondence. And worried about security, he refused to divulge to Army finance officers the names of his operatives, listing them on expense reports only by their initials. Pinkerton used women to infiltrate rebel social circles. He recruited runaway slaves to collect information. He infiltrated spies into Richmond. He sent McClellan lengthy intelligence reports on what those spies found. And he succeeded in breaking up a Confederate espionage ring in Washington. But he ended up being a failure as a military intelligence officer. Pinkerton and his agents had no military training or the experience they needed to effectively collect and evaluate intelligence on the enemy army. They were basically amateurs at war. His detectives were accustomed to slowly working cases until they had enough evidence to arrest a suspect and bring him to trial. But military intelligence collection had to be operate far more quickly than that. And Pinkerton violated a cardinal rule for an intelligence officer. He told McClellan what the general wanted to hear, not what his boss needed to hear. That's a big difference, and it's a big deal. Spy masters, the good ones that is, have to be unbiased. They have to be scrupulous in assembling accurate information. And they have to be willing to deliver uncomfortable truths to their leaders. Pinkerton failed to do this. McClellan was convinced the rebel army he faced always outnumbered him. He became practically delusional about it, and he peppered Lincoln with memos demanding more troops before he could move against the Confederates. Instead of setting his boss straight, Pinkerton stoked McClellan's delusion. He fed him wildly inaccurate intelligence reports that intentionally inflated the number of rebel troops the Union general faced. But higher numbers on the enemy was what McClellan wanted to hear. And even if Pinkerton had reported more accurate Confederate numbers that were lower, McClellan would have likely ignored them. McClellan by nature was a timid commander, afraid of winning on the battlefield for fear of losing. Pinkerton's intelligence reports only made him more timid. The Chicago detective revered McClellan, and at one point, he even spied on Lincoln for political intelligence he thought might be useful for the general. Okay, if you're an intelligence director, you ain't supposed to do that kind of stuff. Lincoln soon realized that his young Napoleon had a chronic case of the slows, as he put it. He fired McClellan in early November 1862 after the bloody Antietam battle. Pinkerton followed his boss out the door and resigned as the Potomac Army's intelligence chief. Now to our next spy. This is Lafayette Baker. Think of Lafayette Baker as kind of like Lincoln's J. Edgar Hoover, but with a couple of big differences. First, Baker didn't have much interaction with Lincoln as Hoover did with his presidents, even though Baker bragged to others that he and Lincoln were real tight. And second, Baker was far more corrupt. He ended up working as a secret agent for Edwin Stanton, the very efficient and very ruthless war secretary who became Lincoln's czar for internal security. Baker's operation grew eventually to some 30 full-time detectives who did more counter-espionage and criminal investigations than actually collecting intelligence. Simple crime back then was considered a national security threat as grave to the Union as espionage. So Secret Service organizations like Baker's and even Pinkerton's often spent more time chasing smugglers, horse thieves, draft dodgers, crooked contractors, and counterfeiters than they did on actual cloak and dagger work. Baker set up his headquarters in an old two-story brick building on Pennsylvania Avenue near the Capitol. A plaque hung in his office proclaiming "Death to traitors." He bragged that his ideal operative was someone who was shrewd, courageous, and couldn't be bribed. But his men, many of them former California vigilantes skilled with knives and pistols and killing without remorse, hardly lived up to that standard. Baker enjoyed shadowing suspects himself and setting up his own stings to catch them. He led raids into southern Maryland to break up rebel courier pipelines that carried mail and merchandise to the south. Baker enjoyed interrogating suspects. For example, tapping on a woman's breast to see if he heard the sound of tin being hit. It would indicate she concealed contraband drugs for the South in the top of her corset. Okay, I'm not making this up, folks. It really happened. One time he hacked a suspected Confederate spy to death with the rebels' own Bowie knife. But soon complaints and reports began accumulating that Baker and his detectives were abusing their authority. Baker's agents became notorious for routinely seizing suspects without warrants and jailing them for weeks. Washington officials also wondered how Baker, on a salary that amounted to only about $7 a day, maintained such a lavish lifestyle, staying in first-class hotels, a wad of cash always in his pocket, and riding about Washington dressed gaudily and on top of an expensive black stallion fit for a general. He did so the old-fashioned way, by abusing his expense account from the secret funds that Stanton supplied him, and by ingeniously finding out ways to shake the money tree on many of the raids and arrests he carried out. So, for example, blockade runners who had been caught found they could soon be released if they paid Baker or one of his detectives a bribe. Baker's biggest intelligence failure came with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Now, guarding the President of the United States was not specifically Baker's responsibility, but uncovering threats to him certainly was. Baker liked to brag that there were no hostile agents in Washington that he or his men didn't know about. But that was clearly not the case, particularly not with John Wilkes Booth, who frequently gathered with his gang at Mary Surratt's boarding house on H Street in Washington, just 9 blocks from Baker's headquarters. Baker redeemed himself when his detectives, accompanied by a cavalry regiment, captured and killed Booth at the Garrett Farm in Virginia. Incidentally, Baker was outraged when he had to share the reward money for Booth's capture with the other men on the raid at Garrett Farm. Now, let's turn to our third spy. This is George Sharp. When General Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker took command of the Army of the Potomac in January 1863, he summoned Sharp to his headquarters after he learned that the New York officer was fluent in French. Hooker wanted him to translate a book written in French on that country's secret service. Sharp did it quickly, which impressed Hooker, so the general recruited his regimental commander to be a spy master for the Army of the Potomac. Hooker gave the espionage service Sharp created a bland-sounding cover name. They called it the Bureau of Military Information, which conveniently obscured its true intent, which is the exact same way intelligence agencies operate today. Although Sharp had been in combat and he was well versed in the military and what kind of information the Army needed, he knew nothing about spying when he took this job. But Sharp proved to be surprisingly adept at cloak and dagger work. In some of his correspondence, he began to use the code name Colonel Straight, and many of his informants never knew they were working for a Union espionage agency. Today, the CIA calls that a false flag operation. Sharp eventually had a force of some 70 agents, many of whom infiltrated into enemy territory wearing rebel uniforms and carrying thousands of Confederate dollars for bribes. He set up a large letter opening operation. His men captured bags full of Confederate mail exchanged between Virginia and Maryland, and they read their contents for hints of rebel troop activities. In what amounted to aerial propaganda, one of Sharp's officers even rigged a kite to drop leaflets over enemy lines, offering money to rebels to defect. And the operation actually proved to be quite successful. Sharp also wasn't shy about using torture to get the truth out of rebel prisoners he thought were lying to his interrogators. Sometimes they were tied by their thumbs or tied up by their thumbs, which prisoners found particularly painful when it was applied for long periods. But more important, with Hooker's blessing, Sharp pioneered what spy agencies today call all-source intelligence. Sharp now raked up all the intelligence coming into the Army of the Potomac, not only from the reports from his spies, but also the reports from the interrogation of rebel deserters and prisoners, the reports from aeronauts in the balloons, from the signal officers intercepting enemy telegraph and signal flag messages, and the dispatches from cavalry scouts. Sharp's officers then sorted, synthesized, and analyzed this flood of information and produced for Union commanders highly accurate intelligence reports with the most comprehensive picture of the enemy that they'd ever had. Now, it sounds like a pretty obvious way to run a spy agency, but this all-source intelligence wasn't done before Sharp. His Bureau of Military Intelligence, or his Bureau of Military Information, was a major innovation. It was decades ahead of its time. Sharp's men, for example, produced leather-bound 14-page booklets that Army commanders could carry in their coat pocket for accurate information on regiments, brigades, and divisions in Lee's forces. Excuse me. His estimates of the number of men in Lee's army at one point was off by only 1/4% from the actual number that Lee had. That's truly remarkable, even by today's standard. Sharp's best agent in Richmond became Elizabeth Van Lew, our fourth spy. This old maid, who everyone dismissed as a harmless Yankee lover, just too free with her opinions, moved quickly from helping Union war prisoners in Richmond to organizing a sophisticated spy ring in the capital of the Confederacy that their security agents were never able to track or to crack. Van Lew's spy network eventually was churning out an average of 3 intelligence reports a week for Sharp. They covered a wide range of subjects: Richmond's defenses, the condition of Lee's army, the troop movements between the Confederate capital and the Shenandoah Valley, economic conditions in the city, the morale of its residents. Along with her message, Van Lew also sent Grant editions of the Richmond papers, plus a rose she picked from her garden for each delivery. Grant thought the rose for his breakfast tables was actually a pretty nice touch. Van Lew's Churchill mansion became her spy's base station. She had several dozen agents and couriers working for her. Each one carried a carved peach seed that identified them as a member of her network. Many of her operatives were farmers or storekeepers or factory workers she had recruited. Others were African-American servants who worked for Van Lew or for other ring members. Her spies also included a clerk in the Confederate Adjutant General's office who provided her with strength reports on rebel units. She had a mole in the engineering department who sent her blueprints for rebel defenses around Richmond and Petersburg. In their intelligence summaries for Grant and other Union generals, Sharp and his aides rarely mentioned Van Lew by her name. She often went by the code name Babcock, or was simply referred to in government documents as a lady in Richmond, and her ring was called Our Friends in Richmond. At night, in her mansion, Van Lew placed sensitive papers, such as agent reports and her own intelligence notes, at her bedside table to destroy them quickly if she had to, or to quickly hide them in other places of the mansion, like the library. Documents there could be stored in the pilasters of the library's iron fireplace that reached partway up to its mantel. 2 bronze couchant lions with secret cavities in them sat atop the pilasters. They were the ideal hiding place. Elizabeth had several ways to write messages to her Union handlers. She could write letters to a fictitious uncle assigning her name as Elijah A. Jones, and send them through the regular mail that was allowed to pass between the South and the North. But between the lines of innocuous family news in these letters, she would dip her pen into a bottle of clear liquid and write out in invisible ink the real message she wanted to deliver. A Union officer on the other end then would apply a mild acid and heat to the paper to read the secret report. Oftentimes, she didn't use the mail system and had couriers deliver her intelligence reports to the Union Army. She would encipher her messages using a simple key that Union officers provided her, which was a small square sheet of paper that contained a chart to convert letters to a number code. Elizabeth kept that key folded up tightly and tucked into her watch case. As a further security measure, Van Loo often tore her encrypted notes into several pieces and sent each piece by different couriers on different routes to the Federals. Her family servants, who acted as couriers, sometimes put the messages in scraped out eggshells hidden in the basket of real eggs or among the paper patterns that seamstresses carried. The Van Loo family had a vegetable farm near the Richmond and Henrico County line, just below the city. That farm became the first stop on a windy route along the James River, where couriers could drop off messages for the Yankees to pick up instructions from Sharp or the intelligence that he needed. George Sharp would boast that whatever Grant wanted in the way of information from the capital, Van Loo's ring could provide it. This was an espionage triumph for the Union, and it was truly remarkable. Okay, with that note, I think I'll open it up for questions or anything that's on your mind.
Yes, Mr. Waller. Pinkerton, as you said, often overestimated the number of troops the South had facing, especially McClellan's army. And I've mentioned this before, past presentations that kind of talked about that. The 1860 census would have been available probably early 1862. I'm assuming it was still done in 1860. I'm not sure with the Civil War coming if they were able to do that. But even looking at the 1850 census, should have told just about anybody that the South would have had a hard time putting out the armies that Pinkerton was saying they had.
Mm-hmm.
The numbers just aren't. I mean, they had. I think it was. I think they started the war with 4 or 5 million white men in the South. Well, not all those are going to go in the army.
Right. Well,
how did they base those estimates on when they?
Well, actually, several things on it. As say, Pinkerton, he intentionally inflated those numbers, and he told McClellan he was intentionally inflating them. The other Lincoln and other commanders eventually grew suspicious of those numbers, but not really at the outset. They didn't really have a clear picture of the enemy themselves. Also, the Confederates ran a fairly effective psychological operation, PSYOPs, in trying to convince the North that its units were larger than they were. As I recall, and the exact numbers in the book, they were able to convince the Union Army that their regiments numbered something like on the order of 900 men, 900 to 1,000 men, when in reality, they were around 300 to 600 men. But some of the people that Confederate officers that Pinkerton's men captured would put out this higher number. They were given the higher number by their generals because they wanted to paint the picture that they had a larger force than they actually did. Now, there were people within Pinkerton's organization that actually had more accurate numbers that they found in the field. Timothy Webster was a very excellent spy that Pinkerton had that was reporting more accurate lower numbers. What Pinkerton did was when he got those reports from, for example, from Webster, he assumed that there were probably regiments or units out there that Webster never saw, phantom units. And so he bulked up those numbers to include what he thought were phantom regiments, to make them higher up, so McClellan would accept them. Interesting, McClellan also never showed Pinkerton's intelligence reports to Lincoln or anybody higher up, because he knew that if he did, they could see very simple math errors that Pinkerton had in his reports that inflated the numbers, and evidence in there where Pinkerton was conspiring with McClellan to jack up the numbers. So McClellan would increase them even more when he reported them to Lincoln. As I say, Lincoln eventually started to catch on to this. And in fact, at one point, he was talking to a delegation that came in, and I think I've got the right numbers here. It's in the book. He told him, he said, well, the Confederate Army numbers about 3 million men. And they all kind of looked at him, kind of startled. He said, "How, you know how I know this? Because every time one of my generals gets defeated on the battlefield, he always says he faced 3-to-1 odds. And I know I got 1 million men, so the other side must have 3 million men." So, McClellan was starting to see what was going on here. He never actually really confronted Pinkerton on that. But after a while, he was paying no attention to Pinkerton's memos demanding more troops.
What would have been I can kind of see maybe what the benefit of inflating the numbers were. If you did lose, you always had that excuse, but it didn't seem to be, for when you met with your staff, then your corps generals, you couldn't be giving those numbers to them. You don't want to send them into battle always thinking they're outnumbered.
Yeah, in fact, some of his subordinate commanders questioned those numbers too and didn't believe them. McClellan, as I say, basically wanted to train and parade and accumulate more people in his army than he actually did wanting to fight with them. So, as I say, when he eventually went into battle, he would always claim in the messages going up to Lincoln that he was facing outnumbered odds. This kind of set up a kind of a systemic problem within his own command, that throughout, the subordinate commands, they would actually believe what they were hearing and go into battle thinking they were outnumbered. But as I say, they actually weren't. And what happened in McClellan's case was that once the fighting got tough, even if he outnumbered him, the fighting was pretty tough and incurring a lot of casualties, he would back off. He wouldn't go the second day to pursue the enemy, even though he may have scored a victory the first day. Unlike Grant, who, just kept on charging ahead and ahead and ahead and disregarded disregarded is too strong a term, but did not let the heavy casualties he was suffering cause him to back off or stand down for a day before each attack. It was a different command philosophy. In McClellan's case, particularly like at Antietam, the heavy casualties, even though he had a good many of his reserves there that could have fought the next day, it broke him as a commander, and he didn't want to pursue it. He wasn't the only one. There were other commanders that had that same problem.
McClellan had a history of never getting his whole army engaged. Antietam, he had a couple of corps he never engaged.
Mm-hmm.
The 7-day battles down by Richmond on the Peninsula campaign, he kept his army split. He
Mm-hmm.
never had the whole army facing Lee.
Right.
It's just a corps or two doing all the fighting. He did a bad job of bringing his troops to bear.
Yeah, and in fact, for example, when Joe Hooker took over the Army of the Potomac, one of the first pieces of instruction that Lincoln gave him is, in the next fight, put in all your army. And of course, Hooker didn't either.
Yeah.
We didn't, and this isn't particular to the Civil War. It happens in other wars too, World War II, World War I. the Union side, it took them about 3 years to bring up the generals who had been blooded enough in battle and were tough-minded military men that were going to win this war and close it out. The South started with those generals really in the beginning. The North had to develop them over time.
I have a question. I've always been interested in Special Orders 191 of Lee's. Was
Right.
that found by spies or was that found by accident? And do you address that in your book at all, what McClellan does or doesn't do with these orders that you find?
Yeah, good question. It is, and I've got a lot in the book on it. It was just two guys, two enlisted men happened to stumble on it. They were sitting down by a fence and resting themselves, and one of them spotted some nice cigars wrapped up. He was more interested in the cigars, but they opened up and saw that the Special Orders 191 was the wrapper for it, and that went up the command, giving it was a major intelligence failure for Robert E. Lee. Again, though, he was saved by the fact that McClellan was really too slow to act on the intelligence and really score a decisive victory. But that's the way a lot of these. I mean, you know, it's fun. It's watching movies, you know, about the secrets. You know, spy versus spy stuff, you know, the James Bond type stuff. A lot of intelligence, though, is collected. And it's been my experience covering the CIA just by accident, you know, like these two enlisted guys having to sit down in the right place. And the intelligence find was there because somebody on the Confederate side dropped out of their pouch. They lost it, never delivered it to the right general.
It's amazing everybody didn't know everything, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, it's but even so, and I point this out in the book. You know, and intelligence was a factor in the Civil War, but it didn't win the Civil War for the North. Okay, anytime you see a book or a movie in any war that says this spy operation won the war for us or is the key to the war, you know, be immediately skeptical of it because that wasn't the case in the Civil War. It wasn't the case in World War I. It wasn't the case in World War II. In the Civil War, even if the South had the better intelligence service, the best service, and the North had the worst. Actually, the exact opposite was the case. The North would have still won. Okay, they simply had more men, more machine, more industrial capacity that was going to wear down the South, you know, and basically, you know, attrition warfare was going to bring it to a halt. Same thing happened in World War II.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Is that true of the Revolutionary War also?
I'm not an expert on the Revolutionary War, but it became a war of attrition. I know for the British Army because they, you know, their lines, what they call lines of communication, which was their supply line from England, were stretched thin. And that particular army, actually, it was the French intervention, I think, that really made the difference there, provided the naval power and firepower, and also a good bit of leadership that helped out there. But that was actually an example of where hit and run tactics, as I understand it, had more to play on the American side. But again, I'm not an expert on the Revolutionary War, so I don't want to get myself in trouble here with something that's wrong.
Well, thank you.
During the Revolution, the British were kind of confined to the coastline, other than maybe down in their South Carolina and Georgia campaign where they tried to move inland, and that actually didn't work for them either because of the Patriots down south used the hit and run and
Right.
Basically sent them, you know, running through the woods and hit them where they weren't. And that basically led to Yorktown. When they had to vacate the South, they moved back north.
Mhm.
Cornwallis.
Yeah, I do know the British, and I've studied this a little bit, had an excellent espionage operation. Turned out to be very effective. The Cowpens gang in New York was very, very effective. Actually, Washington operated as his own intelligence officer. He didn't have someone on his staff as a G2 or somebody who was going to do all his intelligence work. He did it. He did it himself. Actually, so did Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was basically his own intelligence officer, whereas Grant had a staff person, which was George Sharp, heading up that. Lee really didn't. He did a lot of it himself. Didn't really trust spies that much. Didn't trust women spies. He didn't think women were capable of spying. When actually, as Elizabeth Van Lew proved, the best spies during the war on the Union side were women.
Question, please.
Yep.
The examples you give are all from the Eastern Theater. Did you find anything from the Western Theater of the same ilk?
Yeah, I did, and I had to. This book only concentrates on the Eastern Theater, just because I'd run out of room. I'd have to do another volume for that. But I studied that a little bit because Baker would very often go into the Western Theater with his own operations. Generally, though, in that theater, the Union Army had much more successful operations in it. The one place that the Confederacy stirred up a lot was in trying to foment fifth column movements in the Northwest and also in the Northeast too, but also in the Northwest. That there's still a debate among historians over how successful they were. Eventually they did get crushed, but I had to actually focus it down to the Eastern Theater. There's some new scholarship though coming out that posits that the Western Theater was a more important military theater than it was given credit for. I chose the Eastern one just because the two capitals were located in it, and because a good bit of the Eastern press was focused on the Eastern Theater. The New York Times, the Washington papers were all covering this area intensely. And Lincoln knew that he wasn't going to be able to win the war unless he subdued the Eastern Theater, even though they had actually more military gains on the Western side. And I'm afraid I don't know much about military operations in Minnesota. I should have boned up on that before I got on this conference call.
All right. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, if you're interested in this book or any of other of Douglas Waller's publications, you can purchase them through his website right here, douglascwaller.com. I'll also include a link to that when I email out his presentation, hopefully by the end of the day tomorrow. I want to thank you all for coming.
Can I mention one other thing? I'm sorry, I actually, this is kind of a shameless plug, but you may have already seen it. The Smithsonian Channel just came out with a documentary on Elizabeth Van Lew that's really quite good. And it was based partly on my book, and I was in it a lot. So I wasn't all that great at it, but the documentary was actually very interesting. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but I'd highly recommend it. And I have a link to it on my website, or my web designer said she just put it up, so you might be able to watch it through there. It's kind of exciting.
Cool.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, that sounds fascinating. I'm sure members would appreciate learning more about that. So
it's under videos.
Under videos? Oh, perfect.
Yeah, videos and articles.
Oh.
It should be there. Yeah, I think it may be the top one.
Southern.
Yeah, Southern Women, Yankee Spies.
Oh, perfect. All right. So you just go to videos and articles, videos, And here is more information about
I haven't
that.
checked it out that it works, but she said it works.
We'll trust her.
Okay.
All right. So the next meeting in the roundtable is going to be on March 20th. Our speaker is going to present virtually, but I think we'll meet in person at the Litchfield Opera House. If you have any questions or concerns, you can email me at director@meekercomuseum.org. I want to thank Douglas Waller for logging in from North Carolina to talk to us about Lincoln Spies, and I want to thank all of you for logging into this meeting today. That being said, we're gonna end our talk and keep warm.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right, I'll talk to you all soon.